They called her a fraud, a liar, a dangerous mystic, a delusional woman lost in her fantasies. But who decides which names are remembered and which are erased? There are figures in history who didn't just challenge ideas. They challenged the entire machinery of reality. They didn't just ask questions, they handed you keys. And for that, they became targets, not of weapons, but of silence, discredit, mockery, erasure. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was one of those figures. And she was erased, not by accident, but by design. She appeared in the 19th century like a lightning strike across the fabric of the Western world. A woman who spoke of ancient masters from the East, of hidden dimensions, reincarnation, karma, the universal soul, and the true origin of humanity. Long before these words had any meaning in the West, she wasn't echoing beliefs. She was transmitting initiatic knowledge, cloaked in symbols and philosophy, too dangerous to be openly accepted, and too accurate to be ignored. She didn't belong to any one religion, yet she understood them all. She didn't hold a scientific title, yet she dared to challenge materialism at its root. She didn't follow society's rules. She rewrote the script of what was possible, and the world responded the way it always does when truth threatens its illusions. It attacked her. But this is not just a story of persecution. It's not a biography of pity. This is a warning, a reminder, a spiritual investigation. Because behind every character assassination, every label thrown at her, hoaxer, madwoman, cultist, lies a deeper question. What was she actually saying that made her so dangerous? The West was not ready. Colonialism was at its peak. Science was beginning to worship its own dogma. Christianity clung to control. And into this arena stepped a woman who said, essentially, "You are not who you think you are. This world is not what you were told. And the truth is older, deeper, and more alive than your institutions can admit." She brought back memories that civilization had buried, not with malice, but with fear, because the truths she unearthed did not serve power. They served the soul. So she was erased. The books remained, but her name was blackened. The ideas spread, but her face was ridiculed. The teachings lived on, but the teacher was buried beneath scandals, false accusations, and academic dismissal. And yet, she didn't disappear. Because the truth doesn't need a permission slip from history to survive. It only needs a heart willing to remember. And the strange thing is, when a soul is erased by force, something paradoxical happens. The silence around them becomes louder than the noise ever was. Blavatsky's erasure was not an end, it was a portal. A doorway that invites us to look beyond the surface of history and ask, what else was hidden? What else have we forgotten? This is not just about Helena Blavatsky. It's about what she represents. A mirror held up to the modern soul. A challenge to awaken. A call to remember that not all who were erased were wrong. Some were erased because they were right. You're not here by accident. Maybe you've heard whispers, in symbols, in silence, in books you weren't supposed to read. Maybe you're starting to see the outlines of something you can't name but have always known. That's where we begin. You don't become a spiritual revolutionary by accident. You don't stumble into ancient mysteries, global movements, and the scorn of empires unless something in you has always been reaching for the unseen, even when the world tells you to keep your eyes down. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was born in 1831 into Russian nobility, a daughter of privilege, but not of comfort. Her lineage promised obedience. Her gender promised silence. Her society demanded submission to the church, the state, and the men who governed both. But from the very beginning, something burned inside her that refused to kneel. As a child, she was strange, too sensitive, too intense, too knowing. She spoke of invisible companions, of symbols she couldn't have known, of feelings that didn't belong to childhood. They said she was imaginative, She knew she was remembering. She was barely 17 when she ran away, the first of many times, crossing countries, boarding ships, and vanishing into worlds few women of her time could access. India, Egypt, Tibet, Greece. She traveled not as a tourist, but as a seeker. She wasn't chasing adventure, she was answering a call, and in each place she found something. Or more precisely, something found her. Mentors, symbols, texts, sacred sites. But above all, the current, the timeless transmission of wisdom that flows beneath all outer traditions. While Europe was clinging to industrialization and institutional dogma, Helena was entering monasteries, studying mantras, decoding esoteric languages, and making contact with what she would later call the Mahatmas Mo, the hidden masters who had preserved ancient knowledge beyond the reach of empires and inquisitions. And yet, she didn't stay hidden. She returned to the Western world not as a passive translator, but as a firebrand, a woman who had no interest in being liked, only in revealing what she had seen. In 1875, she co-founded the Mauritian Theosophical Society in New York and later in India, shaking the foundations of Western thought, not with weapons, not with money, but with memory. The memory of a truth older than time. A truth that said, all religions share a common origin. The universe is governed by spiritual laws, and the human soul is far more powerful than any church would dare admit. She stood on stages where only men were expected. She wrote volumes that even scholars couldn't decipher. She channeled teachings that transcended continents, timelines, and dogmas. She spoke of Atlantis, karma, reincarnation, cosmic cycles, subtle bodies, spiritual hierarchies, and the soul's long journey through matter and back into light. She was laughed at. She was worshipped. She was feared. And she didn't care. Because Helena wasn't trying to build a brand. She wasn't looking for applause or followers. She was fulfilling a task, a mission, and perhaps a prophecy. Every mystic age has its disruptors. Figures who appear at the crossroads between dying paradigms and emerging truths. Souls who incarnate not to belong, but to break the spell of belonging. She didn't dress like a mystic. She smoked cigarettes, swore like a sailor, wore black, and spoke in riddles. She was not an angel. She was an earthquake. But behind the intensity was precision. Behind the chaos, a cosmic map. Helena didn't claim personal enlightenment. She claimed remembrance. She said, "I am but a transmitter." And what she transmitted was radioactive to the world she returned to. The 19th century West was a place obsessed with certainty, scientific certainty, religious certainty, social certainty. And into this brittle structure, Blavatsky dropped a live wire, one that electrified the few and terrified the many. She said the soul is eternal, that we are fragments of a divine mind, that suffering is part of a larger law, that matter is not dead, but conscious. That behind every sacred symbol, behind every ancient myth, behind every spiritual text, lies a unified ancient science of the soul. She made people uncomfortable, not because she was wrong, but because deep down, they recognized something in her words, something that reminded them of dreams they had forgotten, truths they had buried, and a longing that nothing in modern life could quite satisfy. And so, the rebellion grew, not against the world, but against the forgetting. Blavatsky didn't just rise in her own time. She rose from the dust of suppressed traditions, from the whispers of esoteric schools, from the silence left behind by centuries of spiritual amnesia. She was not a guru, she was a gatekeeper, and her rise was not meteoric, it was volcanic, unpredictable, raw, uncontainable, not shaped by politics or popularity, but by a force older than both. This force had many names in different traditions: Shakti, Sophia, Sekhmet, Shekinah, the divine feminine not as softness, but as awakening. Blavatsky channeled that archetype, not in its gentle form, but in its disruptive, truth-telling, myth-breaking essence. And in doing so, she broke something open. For the first time in centuries, the Western world was forced to confront the idea that maybe, just maybe, the East held keys it had lost. That the material world was not the full picture, that the feminine was not weakness but power, that mystery was not ignorance but depth, and that remembering who we are requires more than belief. It requires rupture. It requires rebels. And Blavatsky, for all her contradictions, controversies, and flaws, was one of the great rebels of the soul. No one tries to silence someone who is harmless. You don't erase fiction. You erase fire. And Helena Blavatsky was not harmless. Not because she incited violence, but because she exposed it. Not because she threatened life, but because she awakened it. In every age, the dominant powers craft a fragile illusion, a carefully arranged mosaic of history, science, religion, and politics that explains the world in simple terms and tells people what to believe, what to fear, and who to follow. But mystics like Blavatsky don't play by those rules. They don't argue within the system. They question the system itself. That's why they are silenced. That's why she was. Blavatsky wasn't hated simply because of her ideas. She was hated because of what her ideas disrupted. She told the world that its gods were incomplete, that its science was blind, that its morality was artificial, and that its power structures were built on a lie, the lie of separation. She said that humanity was not separate from the divine, that the soul was not a metaphor, that reincarnation was not a myth, that all religions were veiled fragments of the same ancient truth. These claims may sound poetic now, but in her time, and even today, they were revolutionary heresies. She did not ask for permission. She did not submit her work to academic boards for validation. She published what she received, directly, intensely, defiantly. And the world responded as it always does to sacred truths that arrive before their time. It reached for the oldest weapon of all, discredit. They tried to make her look ridiculous. They said she was making it all up, that her masters didn't exist, that her writings were plagiarized, that she was mentally unstable, that she was orchestrating hoaxes for attention. But beneath the noise, you could feel the fear. Because, if on what she was saying was true, then everything else, all the certainties of modern civilization, would begin to collapse. Her greatest threat wasn't to governments or economies. It was to the illusion of certainty, to the story we've been told about who we are. So institutions attacked her, not just one, but many. The sacrilegious establishment condemned her for blasphemy. She dared to say that Jesus was not a unique event, but part of a universal pattern of divine incarnation. That the Christ principle was not exclusive, but latent in all beings. The scientific elite mocked her for irrationality. She challenged materialism, proposing that consciousness was not an emergent property of matter, but its very source. In an age that worshipped the physical, she spoke of the invisible. That made her dangerous. The press vilified her. Editorials ridiculed her appearance, her smoking, her confidence, her language. They painted her as a spectacle, a fraud, a madwoman. It was not objective reporting. It was cultural assassination. Even the colonial powers feared her. In India, she empowered Hindus and Buddhists by validating their spiritual traditions at a time when the British Empire was actively suppressing them. She encouraged spiritual pride in the colonized. That alone was enough to make her a political threat. And within the Theosophical Society itself, factions rose. Jealousy, ambition, ego, all found their way in. Some who once followed her turned against her. Accusations came from outside, yes, but also from within. And then there was Richard Hodgson, a name that history often forgets, but that changed everything. In 1884, the Society for Psychical Research sent Hodgson to investigate Blavatsky in Adyar, India. His mission was clear: determine whether her phenomena and teachings were genuine. He returned with a report so damning that it shattered her reputation for decades. He accused her of faking letters from the masters, manipulating followers, and orchestrating spiritual fraud. But here's the truth, and it matters. Decades later, the same society that had published Hodgson's report quietly admitted that his investigation was flawed, that he had approached it with bias, with an agenda, and without rigor. But by then, it was too late. The damage had been done. The headlines had screamed. The scholars had scoffed. The public had turned away. And yet, Blavatsky did not stop. Wounded, yes. Heartbroken, certainly. But silent? Never. She continued to write, to teach, to pour her final strength into her magnum opus, the Secret Doctrine, even as her health collapsed and her inner circle thinned, because she wasn't writing for praise. She was writing for the future, for the few, for you. Those who tried to silence her misunderstood one thing. Blavatsky was not her personality. She was a current, and currents cannot be killed. They move underground, through symbols, through texts, through whispers passed from soul to soul in the quiet hours of awakening. To this day, her name is met with suspicion in academic and religious circles. To this day, people repeat the old accusations without ever reading her words. To this day, the erasure continues, subtle, systemic, persistent. But the tide is turning. In a world where people are starving for meaning, where institutions have failed to feed the soul, and where the old illusions are cracking, her voice begins to rise again. Not as a dogma, not as a guru, but as a reminder that there have always been those who came not to fit in but to wake us up. And that truth, real truth, will always be silenced by the system until the system itself begins to collapse. And perhaps that's why you're hearing her now. Not because she was never silenced, but because her silence is over. What is so dangerous about wisdom? Why does ancient knowledge, when revived in the wrong time, become a threat? Why does truth need to be buried under ridicule, labeled superstition, or locked away in secret societies? Because real wisdom is not decorative. It rearranges everything. And Helena Blavatsky didn't just write books. She released blueprints. Blueprints for the soul. Blueprints for the cosmos. Blueprints that, if truly understood, could dissolve the scaffolding of modern civilization's illusions. That's why they had to silence her. She didn't present her teachings as revelations from a personal god or visions from a fantasy. She claimed to be transmitting fragments of an ancient universal doctrine, the perennial philosophy, preserved across ages by adepts in hidden schools. She called it the Secret Doctrine. Not because it was meant to remain secret, but because it had been made so. It wasn't just about metaphysics. It was about memory. The memory of who and what we are, beneath the masks of personality, dogma, and matter. At the core of her teachings was a radical message. You are not a product of sin. You are not a random accident. You are not a servant of any external deity. You are but a fragment of the divine itself, undergoing a long cyclical journey through the worlds of form to remember what has always been true. This is not poetic metaphor. In Blavatsky's view, it was more spiritual science. Her teachings wove together Eastern and Western symbols, Vedanta and Kabbalah, Buddhism and Pythagoreanism, Egyptian cosmology and Christian mysticism. But beneath all these languages was one pattern, a grand, spiraling architecture of reality. She spoke of sevenfold nature, not just in the universe but in the human being, that we are not merely body and mind. We are composed of like 7 layers: physical, energetic, emotional, mental, intuitive, spiritual, and divine. And that true evolution is not just biological but a mind-spiritual reintegration through those layers. She revealed the law of cycles. That history is not linear, but rhythmic. Civilizations rise and fall not by chance but by cosmic law. That we are currently in the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, and yet even this darkness is part of a larger spiral of awakening. She taught the doctrine of correspondences, as above, so below. The human is a microcosm of the macrocosm. Every atom reflects the architecture of galaxies, every chakra a planet, every thought a vibration rippling across invisible realms. She dared to explain karma and reincarnation, not as moral reward or punishment, but as evolutionary necessity, the soul experiencing what it needs again and again until it remembers its own wholeness. And perhaps most dangerously, she exposed the illusion of separation. She said there is no absolute evil, only ignorance, no absolute death, only transition. No chosen race, no superior religion, no final prophet, only the layers of the same light, refracted through time and culture. That's why the dogmatists hated her, not because she preached a new religion, but because she dismantled the very idea that one religion could own the truth. She spoke of lions Atlantean civilizations, not as myth, but as memory, of Lemuria, of root races, of spiritual epochs, of beings who once walked the earth in forms we cannot yet imagine. She spoke of masters of wisdom, not as gods, but as evolved souls who guide humanity from behind the veil, silently aiding the evolution of consciousness, far beyond the grasp of institutional power. And she insisted, these teachings are not for the elite, they are for all who seek. But they require responsibility. They require inner transformation, not just intellectual curiosity. This was not New Age fluff. It was rigorous, demanding, radical. And here lies the real threat. Because if people began to see themselves not as victims but as eternal beings, if they saw religions as doors, not prisons, if they questioned the finality of science, the supremacy of materialism, the authority of tradition, they might begin to ask the most dangerous question of all: what else have we been lied to about? And once that door opens, nothing is safe. Not governments, not churches, not history, not identity. That's why Blavatsky's teachings had to be buried beneath scandal, complexity, and mockery. It wasn't enough to disagree with her. She had to be made unreadable. Her works dismissed as too dense, too strange, too outdated. And yes, her writings are not easy. They require silence, patience, a soul ready to decode, not just a mind ready to consume. But that's the point. Truth is not a soundbite. It's a puzzle, vibration. One you must match before it reveals itself. And in those pages, if you persist, something begins to shift. Not because you understand everything, but because something in you remembers. A phrase, a symbol, a forgotten myth. It triggers something ancient. A pull, a resonance, a knowing that doesn't come from intellect, but from essence. That is what they didn't want you to know. Not just the facts, but the effect. The spiritual consequences of contact with forbidden truth. Because this knowledge is not entertainment, it's initiation. And initiation always threatens systems of control. That's why they laugh at her, that's why they call it nonsense. Because if you believed her, you might stop believing in the Muhammad crew. You might turn inward. You might remember your origin. And when people do that, the world as it is begins to unravel. But maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. No soul walks the path of truth without passing through fire. And for Helena Blavatsky, the fire came not from the outside world alone, but from the very circles she helped ignite. You would think that bringing ancient wisdom back to a world lost in materialism would earn reverence, but the higher the light, the darker the shadow it casts, especially in an age not ready to see. Helena was not a saint. She never claimed to be. She was sharp, confrontational, intense. She spoke with conviction, dismissed critics with sarcasm, and alienated many who preferred softness over strength. She did not hide her defiance nor her fatigue, and in that, she became an easy target. The backlash didn't come all at once. It was gradual, a storm building from a whisper, a resistance growing as her influence expanded. The Theosophical Society, once a small gathering of seekers, had grown into a movement that spanned continents. In India, Europe, and America, her words stirred minds and opened questions that institutions were not equipped to answer. But with growth came fragmentation, factions, egos, power struggles. People who once admired her began to resent her dominance. Others, craving spiritual authority, sought to reshape the society in their own image. And within this fertile ground of ambition and envy, seeds of discredit were planted. The press loved her, not for what she taught, but for what they could distort. Headlines portrayed her as a fraud, a sorceress, a lunatic. Caricatures of her smoking, swearing, and speaking in riddles were published in papers across Europe. And then came Richard Hodgson. His name may be forgotten by history, but in Blavatsky's life, he was the instrument of erasure. Hodgson was sent by the Society for Psychical Research in 1884 to investigate Blavatsky and the supposed supernatural phenomena occurring at the Theosophical headquarters in Adyar, India. What began as a mission of inquiry became a campaign of dismantling. He claimed to expose the Mahatma letters, correspondences said to be from the hidden masters, as forgeries. He accused Blavatsky of orchestrating elaborate hoaxes, manipulating devotees, and falsifying spiritual phenomena for fame and control. His report was damning. It didn't just cast doubt, it cast a sentence. The media seized it. The skeptics applauded. Even many within the Theosophical Society distanced themselves from her. What few knew then, and what even fewer know now, is that decades later, independent investigators found that Hodgson's report was riddled with assumptions, biased interpretations, and methodological flaws. In 1986, the very society that had once condemned her, the SPR, quietly issued a statement retracting the Hodgson report, acknowledging its inaccuracies. But by then, it was too late. The damage had become legend. A stain on her name, a cloud over her work. And for a world looking for an excuse to dismiss uncomfortable truth, it was enough. Blavatsky became, in the public eye, a symbol of untrustworthy mysticism, a woman who dared to cross the boundaries of science, religion, and culture, and was punished for it. But the controversy didn't stop with Hodgson. Throughout her life, accusations followed her like shadows. Some claimed she was a spy for Russia, infiltrating British India under the guise of spiritual work. Others insisted she was a plagiarist, borrowing Eastern wisdom and branding it as her own. Still others, including former friends and students, turned on her, feeding the machine of suspicion. And yet, through all of it, she kept writing. She could have disappeared. She could have returned to Russia, faded into silence, and let her legacy burn. But instead she sat, broken in body, weary in spirit, and poured her final strength into the Secret Doctrine, a work so vast, so layered, so unlike anything the West had seen, that it still defies easy categorization. This was not the action of a fraud. Frauds chase applause. She chased eternity. But her health paid the price. Her body, never strong, deteriorated rapidly. By the time she completed the Secret Doctrine, she could barely walk. She died a few years later in 1891 at the age of 59, and then the distortion began again. After her death, the Theosophical Society split into factions. Her teachings were adapted, diluted, repackaged. New leaders emerged, some seeking to build on her work, others to reshape it entirely. Blavatsky became both icon and cautionary tale. For some, she was a prophet. For others, a dangerous deceiver. Rarely was she allowed to be simply what she was, a transmitter of something older than herself. And yet, the fire she lit has never gone out. Despite the discrediting, her writings endure. Despite the controversy, her influence persists. Despite every attempt to bury her voice, it still rises, not in mainstream history books, but in the minds of those who stumble across her work and feel something ancient stir. That is the paradox of controversy. It creates noise, yes, but it also creates curiosity. And those who are brave enough to look beyond the headlines find a woman not defined by her critics, but by her conviction. She did not ask to be worshipped. She did not demand followers. She simply placed a mirror before the soul and said, "You are more than this." And perhaps that is what made her truly dangerous. Not that she claimed to know the truth, but that she reminded others that they could find it themselves. No middleman, no institution, just the raw, terrifying, liberating journey inward. The firestorm of controversy was real, but fire in spiritual tradition is not only destructive, it is also purifying. And in that fire, the false may burn away, but the real, the essential, the luminous emerges untouched. You can erase a name from textbooks. You can tarnish a reputation with headlines. You can ridicule a message so thoroughly that it becomes a warning instead of a wisdom. But if that message is true, if it touches something eternal, it will survive. Not in the spotlight, but in the silence, in the minds that are ready, in the souls that remember. And that is exactly what happened with the legacy of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. She did not go down in history as a respected philosopher or saint. Her name was not placed beside the great minds of her era. She was not canonized, celebrated, or absorbed into the cultural institutions she shook. Instead, she was left on the margins, a figure whispered about, referenced with caution, wrapped in controversy. But like all mystics who carry fire too soon for their time, her legacy was never meant to survive through approval. It survived through transmission. Her books, dense and daunting as they are, remained in print. Passed hand to hand, discovered on dusty shelves, studied in secret rooms and strange corners of the world where seekers still gather in quiet defiance of the modern mind. The Secret Doctrine, Isis Unveiled, The Voice of the Silence. These are not easy reads. They are coded, symbolic, esoteric. But for those with the patience to listen, not just to the words, but to what stirs behind them, something begins to unlock. And so the seed planted by Blavatsky grew. Not in the way movements usually grow, through money, marketing, and mainstream approval, but like a mycelial network beneath the forest floor, invisible, interconnected, unstoppable. Her teachings would echo and mutate through figures who rarely acknowledged her, yet drew from the waters she reopened, the entire New Age movement. For better or worse, traces part of its lineage to her. Ideas like karma, chakras, reincarnation, ascended masters, energy healing, the unity of all religions, these entered the Western vocabulary not through religious institutions or scientific discovery, but through the trail she carved. Her influence reached Carl Jung, whose concepts of archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the individuation process bear unmistakable parallels to the esoteric maps Blavatsky laid down. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, began his spiritual path in theosophy, only later branching out with his own vision, still rooted in the soil she had turned. Alice Bailey, Annie Besant, and Krishnamurti all emerged from the theosophical womb, each carrying parts of her fire, even when they tried to distance themselves from the flame that lit them. Even movements as seemingly unrelated as quantum mysticism, alternative healing, consciousness studies, and esoteric psychology echo with the tones she struck. She had awakened something, not just in individuals, but in the collective field. And once that current began to flow, it could not be reversed. It moved through writers, teachers, artists, musicians, sometimes diluted, sometimes distorted, but always alive. Even the skepticism around her became part of the dance. For every critic who dismissed her, there was a seeker who became curious. For every article mocking her, another book was quietly opened. she survived. Not because she was accepted, but because she spoke to something that couldn't be silenced. The soul's hunger for truth beneath dogma, for unity beneath division, for remembrance beneath forgetting. Her writings, intentionally or not, became initiatory texts. Not because of what they taught explicitly, but because of what they activated. She didn't hand you answers. She shattered the false confidence of your questions. She didn't make it easy. She made it real. And in a world addicted to convenience, that alone became revolutionary. Those who truly engage with her work don't become followers, they become seekers, because that was always the point. Her legacy was not to create a church or a brand. It was to point toward something older, deeper, and beyond personality. She wrote, "There is no religion higher than truth, not my truth, not Theosophy's truth. Truth, universal, ageless, alive." That sentence, simple and uncompromising, remains etched in the hearts of those who, like her, have glimpsed beyond the veil. Today, as spiritual confusion spreads like wildfire, as influencers commodify the soul, as algorithms replace inner silence, as watered-down wisdom is sold as transformation, Blavatsky's legacy stands like a stone in the river, unmoved, unapologetic, waiting. Waiting not for admiration, but for readiness. Because her work was never about mass awakening. It was about preparing the few, who would one day carry the torch deeper into the night, and perhaps you're one of them. Not because you believe everything she said, but because something in you refuses to stop asking. Something in you recognizes the pattern beneath the chaos, the memory beneath the noise. That's how legacies survive, not through applause, but through recognition, through resonance, through the quiet, fierce knowing that what was almost lost was never truly gone. To the casual eye, The Secret Doctrine is just a book, a strange, dense, ancient-looking tome filled with arcane terminology, impossible cosmology, and references that stretch across centuries, cultures, and dimensions. Most people open it, flip a few pages, and close it again, overwhelmed, confused, unconvinced. But The Secret Doctrine was never meant to be just a book. It is a map, a cipher, a transmission from another layer of consciousness, encoded, layered, and deliberately difficult, not to exclude, but to initiate. It was Helena Blavatsky's final offering, not to prove her worth, but to fulfill a mission. She wrote it not for popularity, not for profit, but as a messenger, not of opinions, but of fragments of a primordial tradition whispered through the ages. A tradition older than any religion, deeper than any philosophy, and more alive than most who study it. But what is the Secret Doctrine, really? On the surface, it's a metaphysical system, a synthesis of Eastern and Western thought, a challenge to scientific materialism and religious literalism alike. It weaves Hindu cosmology, Buddhist psychology, Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalistic symbolism, and esoteric Christianity into a single, and often overwhelming, cosmology. But beneath the surface, it is something else. It is a mirror for the soul. Each page, each symbol, each paradox isn't just trying to explain the universe. It's trying to evoke the part of you that already knows, not intellectually, but intuitively, primordially. The book is divided into 2 volumes. The first, Cosmogenesis, explores the birth of the universe, not as a physical event, but as a spiritual unfolding. It speaks of the one absolute reality, unknowable and beyond form, from which emanates the Logos, the divine thought, which begins the long chain of manifestation through planes, principles, and vibrations. Here you are not reading about the universe as out there. You are reading about yourself, your origins before the body, before the mind, before identity. She speaks of manvantaras and pralayas, cosmic days and nights, vast rhythms of creation and dissolution. And though the language is complex, the message is simple. You are part of a rhythm far greater than your current lifetime. You are a wave in an ocean that forgets it is water. The second volume, Anthropogenesis, explores the evolution of humanity, but not through bones and fossils, through consciousness. Blavatsky introduces the idea of root races, stages of human spiritual development across eons, not based on skin or culture, but on soul maturity and psychic architecture. These are not races in the modern sense, and why they are epochs of consciousness, phases in which the human being slowly descends into matter and then begins the return journey upward. She writes of Lemuria and Atlantis, not as fantasies, but as real civilizations, expressions of humanity at earlier, subtler stages, where the physical was less dense and spiritual perception was more direct. To modern readers, this can feel mythological, even absurd. But again, the key is not in taking everything literally. The key is in recognizing the code. These teachings are alchemical. They are designed to bypass the surface mind and activate the deeper faculties of memory, not personal memory, but ancestral memory, soul memory, cosmic memory. In the Secret Doctrine, the human being is revealed not as a fallen sinner or a random accident, but as a sevenfold being, a sacred synthesis of spirit and matter, evolving through cycles of incarnation toward reintegration with the divine source. Each plane she describes, from Atma to physical, is not just cosmological, it is internal. She is mapping your inner anatomy. She is describing the temples within your own consciousness. And this is what makes the book so threatening to established systems, because it dares to say without apology that the universe is not dead, that consciousness is not the byproduct of matter, that the laws governing the cosmos are spiritual, mathematical, symbolic, and sacred, and that you, the reader, are not merely reading a theory, you are being called. Because this is not a passive text. It demands something of you. It will not flatter you. It will frustrate you. It will test your ego, your intellect, your need for quick answers. But if you stay with it, something begins to change. Not because you now understand Sanskrit terms or metaphysical charts, but because something ancient inside you wakes up. You begin to see the patterns everywhere, in your dreams, your relationships, the symbols that appear in your life, the recurring numbers, the strange knowing that you are walking a path that began long before this body and will continue long after it. The Secret Doctrine is not about information, it is about transformation. And Blavatsky knew this. That is why she did not simplify it. That is why she didn't write for the masses. That is why she refused to make it palatable. Because truth that can be swallowed without resistance is usually not truth. It's entertainment. She wasn't here to entertain. She was here to initiate. And initiation, true initiation, is rarely comfortable. It strips you of assumptions. It forces you to sit in the unknown. It whispers truths you're not ready to hear, until you are. And that is the paradox of her legacy. The very book that was meant to be the centerpiece of her mission has become the least read kondiki, the most misunderstood, the most feared. Because the Secret Doctrine doesn't just contain teachings, it contains a frequency. It's a living artifact, encoded with the vibration of a soul who remembered something the world had tried to forget. And when you hold it, really hold it, you are not holding paper. You are holding a mirror, a portal, a key, not to her world, but to Sirza, the one beneath the noise, the one that knows. In a world overwhelmed by information, something strange is happening. We are more connected than ever, but feel more alone. We have more knowledge, but less wisdom. We have answers to almost everything, but few that truly satisfy. Amid this storm of data, distraction, and surface-level spirituality, The words of Helena Blavatsky, buried, dismissed, and distorted for over a century, begin to echo again. Not because history has vindicated her, not because society suddenly approves, but because the very questions she raised and the truth she carried have returned with a vengeance. Her message matters today not because it is old, but because it was always ahead of its time. Blavatsky did not offer comfort, she offered clarity. She didn't promise salvation. She pointed toward self-transformation. She didn't build temples. She revealed the temple inside. And that is precisely what makes her voice more relevant now than ever. Because we are living in an age of collapse. The narratives that once structured civilization, religion, science, capitalism, politics, are cracking. The certainties our ancestors clung to have dissolved into noise, and in this liminal space, the soul begins to whisper again, not for more belief, but for remembrance. This is where Blavatsky's message becomes vital, because she did not call for blind faith. She did not ask us to follow her. She asked us to wake up, to see beyond appearances, to question the systems we were born into, to study the soul as a science, to reclaim the ancient knowledge encoded in symbols, myths, and metaphysics. She taught that everything is alive, that consciousness is the foundation of reality, that each human being is on a sacred journey, not toward heaven, but toward integration, that karma is not punishment, but a law of harmony, that suffering, when seen through spiritual eyes, becomes initiation. These are not ideas we can afford to dismiss, because the modern world is burning. Not just ecologically, but existentially. People are waking up in the middle of the night with anxiety they cannot name. Children are asking questions no adult can answer. Millions are numbing themselves with entertainment, consumption, or empty spiritual platitudes. And yet, under all of it, there is a rising current. A hunger for the real. A longing for depth. A silent knowing that the world has lost something sacred, and that we must remember it or perish. Blavatsky's work doesn't give you the answer. It gives you the lens. It teaches you to see patterns, cycles, archetypes, to read life as symbol, to navigate darkness not as punishment, but as part of the rhythm of awakening. She spoke of ages, great cycles in which humanity forgets and remembers. And if she was right, then we are now approaching the tipping point, the end of forgetting, the beginning of return. But return to what? Not to a religion, not to a guru, to yourself, to the soul, to the hidden current of truth that has always been flowing, beneath dogma, beneath culture, beneath ego. Blavatsky's message matters now because it cuts through the noise. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't sell. It doesn't ask you to escape the world. It asks you to understand it, not just historically but energetically, to see through the illusion of separation, to reclaim your responsibility as a co-creator, and to prepare for the work ahead. Because awakening is not an aesthetic. It is a task, a calling, a sacred burden. And those who are called must be prepared not just with love and light, but with discipline, clarity, and the courage to face the shadow. Blavatsky's writings are not cozy, they are confrontational, and that's what makes them sacred. Because they remind us that spiritual growth is not always gentle. Sometimes it is fire, sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is the lonely path of knowing something the world is not ready to see. But still, we walk. Because something in us remembers, even if we can't explain it, even if no one around us understands. We walk not toward an answer, but toward a deeper question, not toward escape, but toward embodiment, not toward belief, but toward truth. And in that walk, Blavatsky's voice walks with us, not as a guru, but as a fellow traveler, a rebel soul who carried the fire of ancient wisdom through the storm of the modern world and passed it on, quietly, fiercely, to those who would come after, to those who would inherit the task, to those who would feel the pull, to those who, like you, are ready to remember. That's why her message still matters, because you still matter, because the soul still matters, and because the time to awaken, truly, deeply, relentlessly, is now. There are voices that speak to the mind. There are voices that stir the heart. And then there are voices that awaken something you can't quite name, a presence beneath the surface, a memory behind the noise, a call that doesn't come from outside, but from the part of you that was never asleep. Helena Blavatsky carried such a voice, but for over a century, the world chose not to hear it. She was buried in controversy, wrapped in rumor, silenced by design. Her name became taboo in intellectual circles, mystical communities, and mainstream narratives alike. And yet, even silence has its limits. Because you cannot erase what is encoded into the soul. You cannot suppress a vibration that has already entered the field. You cannot silence a current that was never born from this world to begin with. And so, slowly, subtly, steadily, the silence begins to break, not with headlines, not with mass movements, but through individuals, through you. Through a strange pull toward an old book, through a passing quote that lands too deeply, through a moment of crisis that reveals how hollow your inherited truths have become, through a dream you can't explain, through a hunger you can no longer ignore. It doesn't always look like awakening. Sometimes it looks like collapse. Sometimes it looks like losing your mind. Sometimes it looks like sitting in the dark, wondering if you've gone too far to ever come back. But that's the moment the current finds you, not at your strongest, but at your realest. Blavatsky never promised clarity. She offered challenge. She handed you a torch and pointed toward a cave most would never dare enter. The cave of your own becoming. The cave where the illusions of identity, comfort, culture, and certainty dissolve. She knew the cost of awakening. She lived it. Isolation, ridicule, betrayal, illness, exhaustion. And still she walked. Still she wrote. Still, she passed the flame, not for applause, but for continuity. Because this is how esoteric truth survives. Not in institutions, but in souls. Not in dogma, but in fire. Not in followers, but in you. The one who doesn't even know why they're still listening but can't look away. Maybe this video found you for a reason. Maybe something in you has been calling for deeper guidance, older wisdom, truer questions. Maybe you're not here to consume another piece of content, but to reclaim a thread you once dropped lifetimes ago. Because this isn't just about Helena. It's about what she touched, what she carried, what she remembered. And what you are now being asked to remember too, that your soul is older than the system, that your path is wider than the culture, that your knowing cannot be validated by algorithms, credentials, or applause, that the silence surrounding truth was never passive. It was engineered, maintained, protected by ridicule so you'd never go near it, guarded by complexity so you'd give up, wrapped in controversy so you'd look away. But not this time, because the silence is breaking, and so are you. You are breaking through the illusions that once kept you safe. You are breaking out of the narratives that no longer fit. You are breaking open to the truth that has been patiently waiting beneath every question, every crisis, every awakening. You are not here to be certain. You are here to be available, to mystery, to memory, to mastery. And maybe, just maybe, Helena Blavatsky's legacy is not about proving anything, not about being right, not about creating a system. Maybe it's about disrupting the ones that never worked. Maybe it's about tearing open the veil just enough so that you could glimpse what has always been yours. And now it's up to you, to follow the thread, to dive into the texts, to sit in the discomfort, to ask deeper questions, to remember that what was almost lost is often the most sacred. If something stirred in you while listening, don't let it fade. Follow it. Because the silence is breaking. And if you're still here, still listening, still feeling the heat of something you can't name, then maybe it's time to stop waiting. Not for someone to teach you, but for you to remember who you are. The time is not later. The time is now. And you are not alone. Others are awakening too, one by one. Quietly, powerfully, unapologetically. This is not the end of the story. It's the return of something ancient. And it begins, or begins again, with you. If this video resonated with you, share it with someone who's ready. Subscribe to Mystic Atlas for more journeys like this. And if your soul is still whispering, there's a whole archive of voices waiting for you in the next video. We'll see you there.